All right. Are we,
Now subdivisions, what? Where does it say that in here? I didn't see that.
It doesn't.
I mean, it just says a minimum of 50 foot, so it could be defined that that would fit for a subdivision. And ever since, I mean, my rule of thumb has been 50 foot that you had to have to go into a highway. State road, why are we different?
This is internal.
Because our roads are 16 and 15 foot.
So this requirement is in regards to the new roads that would serve the subdivision inside the development. So for each new lot created on the road that the developer is going to build to serve the lots in the subdivision, the minimum road frontage for each individual subdivision lot is 20 feet.
okay. And
It's internal to the subdivision, Mr. Dill. It's actually incorporated within. It doesn't have a relationship related to whether it's on a state road or a county road. It's internal.
So it's inside, it's not where it goes into the main house.
Correct. It's not where it goes into the state road or the county road at that point.
So would it have to be
It's inside.
wider where it goes into there?
Well, we currently have regulations that regulate that. So does the state. I think Keisha can speak to what the current regulations are.
This would just be like for the driveway of one property. It has to be at least 20 feet wide in order for them to have ingress and egress. So where we go into the actual out onto the road, we have our different right of way with depending on the how many cars are using it. So it may be anywhere from 42 feet wide up to 50 feet wide.
in 22.3.4, minimum internal setback is not specified. Now, is there an assumption that the HOA would set that or what?
So the developer, so again, it's the developer that's designing this based on once all of the open space is provided and the buffers are provided, they will design it based on what the land that they have available. So they will determine the setbacks for their own development.
Okay, well, that makes sense. I just wondered why it wasn't specified here.
It would, why couldn't we just strike not? Subdivision lots are not. Just strike that not and make it subdivision lots are subject to any minimum. Would it kill anything? Would it hurt anybody? What would it do? Instead of saying not, if you just do away with not.
I think, Joe, it would hurt the developer's flexibility if I have that right. You're making a constraint. It's the big picture of this. You're driving down the big road up in our areas and we don't see a subdivision from the road necessarily. You can
That's right.
drive by and never know there's a subdivision there.
That's right.
What they do on the inside is their business for the market.
That's correct.
That's correct.
I think that's the big picture here, and then we're getting into some of the details.
Well, but what I heard Rashida say is that this is not going to be specified by county regulation, but left up to the developer and the builder and that sort of thing inside the subdivision itself.
Yes, that's correct.
And
And we do that all over the county. Already, we already do in these zoned areas, we don't have setbacks.
We do.
We do, we have setbacks.
I mean, I know the answer to the question, but I'm wondering why we're not requiring setbacks in this. Is it because we already do it? But you saying we're not going to be doing it.
So what?
Help me,
Okay.
help me.
you wanna-
When I read this, I just automatically marked out not.
So, Mr. Dill, I'll try to take your question. So, and Mr. Shaw made a point about the big picture. Digging a little bit deeper, really what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to prioritize the conservation of significant natural resources on a given tract. And so it's staff's opinion that those significant resources, to be truly significant, they need to be contiguous, they need to be large, and they need to be meaningful. And so by eliminating those internal setback requirements, if it's 5 feet or 10 feet in between two lots, that doesn't actually change anything in terms of how the land functions as a natural resource. And so again, we wanted to provide as much flexibility as possible for the development that actually occurs on a site, while at the same time setting up some very clear limitations or restrictions as far as specifically how much of a site can be developed. And so that's where the 50-foot buffer requirements come into play. That's where the 30% set aside of developable open space requirement comes into play. So, oh yeah.
No,
Go
I
ahead.
get it. And also, I can't see any developer deciding, I'm going to put 20 feet between these two houses, but only 5 over here. They'll try to make it uniform,
They're going to be.
I would assume, just because of the way subdivisions are laid out.
I can take you to some subdivisions in the unzoned part of the county where there's no setbacks. Now, I mean, because there's no zoning, I guess that's the reason that they're allowed to, I mean, they're out in the street, almost in the street. So I don't understand why we have to. And then I can ride to a zone part of the county and I see buffers. And I know there's discussion about taking, but if it's all right to take it in zone, what's wrong within the unzone that everybody meets the same qualifications? Is there? I mean, setback. It don't matter whether you're on the Reedy River or whether you're down here in Moonville.
Why don't you tell us what you're thinking? Because I think we've
I'm
answered.
thinking just
Are
take
you-
not out.
Okay, so is it because you feel setbacks should be required and specified?
I think it ought to fit into the community. That's the issue. That development should, I mean, if you're gonna have the density of 6,000 square foot, then it ought to have to fit in some way, and to build them out in the road and build them close to the street. I know it slows down traffic, but
So, okay, so to what you just said about out in the traffic, so remember there's a 50-foot buffer along the existing road. So that means there won't be any houses anywhere near any roads. So if you're a driver or pedestrian, you won't be able to see the development. Okay, so that's the first issue.
that's
was that-
required now.
That's-
50-foot buffer on
No,
all roads.
No,
No.
we're proposing it. This is proposed in this draft
That's
document.
what this says.
Yes,
That's
sir.
correct.
But it says subdivision lots are not subject to any minimum.
Internal. It's internal again, Mr. Dill. It's
That's not
internal.
where the property line is.
No, it's internal to the subdivision. It's not external to the roads or
Talking
along
about
any.
between houses, and I'm talking about the property line between my property and the subdivision.
That's correct. We're talking about between houses. We're not talking about between the road, the main road, or let's say it's along 25. They build a new subdivision. They got a 50-foot buffer. They can't build within that road buffer or that road wide way at all, or within the 50-foot buffer. That's all new to this. All of this, what we're talking about now in the specifications in here is internal to the actual subdivision itself.
All right.
It's not going to touch the road, the main roads or anything because of the buffers.
Understand.
Does that help?
Mr. Chairman?
Ms. Mullins,
Yes, sir.
on this right here, a 50-foot setback, does that mean the house can start at the 50-foot, or is there still a 10-foot off the property line? 50-foot buffer?
Shall be provided for the.
Where's that?
Which section are you looking
Which section are you on, Mike?
You're talking about the 50-foot buffer all the way around. You're talking about
Yeah.
Talking about the houses being built.
Within that 50-foot buffer, existing vegetation shall not be clear cut and existing significant trees will be preserved.
I guess my question is how-
It has to be outside of that. How close? How close to the buffer?
The setback from the lot line.
Oh, it varies. It varies. The important thing is the 50-foot perimeter buffer. Mhm. But what is it currently?
Yeah.
Or matrix?
Mhm.
So it's theoretically, it'd be right up to the property line. It probably won't in practice because of the.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. That was a good question. Well, buffers was the next thing on my list, and I like this 50-foot buffer. Now, is this all the way around the subdivision? Except, of course, where the roads come in.
Yes.
Perimeter of the development.
So front, side, and back. Now, next is the next thing, number B, screening material. Screening plant material shall not be placed within 25 feet of the road right-of-way. Does this mean that where the road right-of-way ends, an additional 25 feet is left open, then screening will be planted?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm driving down the road and I'm gonna have 25 feet and then you'll be putting up the screening
Unless there's existing vegetation.
and then it won't be disturbed.
That's right.
Can I ask what is the optimal spread, I would say in feet of buffer to where you can't see past the buffer? Is there a standard or optimal?
We do have a current standard that's in the LDR in Article 8.21. And I can tell you what that is.
Okay.
In the event there is no natural vegetative buffer, planted deciduous, canopy, or evergreen trees shall be used to create the buffer. In either case, canopy trees shall not be placed closer than 15 feet on center, and evergreen trees shall not be placed closer than 10 feet on center.
Okay, I guess I'm trying to figure out, we have 50 feet of space to work with off the road. Is there a minimum amount of, whether it's natural or planted buffer material where you won't really see the subdivision within that? Does that make sense?
Again, it depends on the site in question.
Okay.
You know, if you're in the hilly part of the, the northern part of the county where you've got some elevation rise from the roadway back into the site, then, 50 feet might look one way. Whereas if you're in the rural southern part of the county where it's relatively flat, an old farm, then, 50 feet is, practically just a curtain. So it just varies.
And it'll vary based on whether it's natural vegetation that's already there, Mr. Shaw, or if it's vegetation that you have to plant. As you know, if you have to plant vegetation, it's going to take a while before it fills out and fills in. And that's what Rashida was reading to you, the specifications for that.
Okay, and you feel comfortable that this 50 feet is enough countywide to buffer adequately or just reasonable, or is that you feel like that's a minimum or that's a good number, or if that makes sense? I'm just saying,
Yeah.
Imagining things. I'm not saying,
Well, Mr. Shaw, if I could, when we put in the qualifications for the business technology district, those are 100-foot buffers. Because now you're talking about potential for plants and things, manufacturing plants.
Multi-story or.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so we have 100-foot buffer down there, so we can always increase it. This is just saying that we're gonna have 50-foot minimum around subdivisions.
Okay.
Is that a correct statement, Ms. Gucker?
Yes, sir.
And typically residential would be what, 2-story at the highest?
generally. Yeah.
Okay. Does this include multifamily or are we just talking about single family?
Well, again, the availability of public sewer would really drive whether you can have something more dense, but in these areas, you're not likely to have a lot of density due to the lack of infrastructure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And thank you for bringing that up. I should have mentioned that most of the area affected in this unzoned area does not have sewer available, which that gets into minimum lot
Minimum lot
size.
size.
Gets rid of that 6,000 feet you were talking about.
Yeah. But now, going on with this, the 50-foot buffer provided along the existing road frontage adjoining the subdivision shall be designated as open space or common area. Now, is that inclusive in the 50-foot buffer called for in the perimeter?
No, Article 22.3.5A is referring to the required buffers along adjoining properties, not the required buffer along the adjoining existing road.
Okay, so what is the 50-foot along the roads is different then? D,
Yes.
okay,
One is referring to the buffers required on the road, and the other is referring to the buffers along adjoining properties out with the exception of the road, the existing road.
all right. Now, number E, the riparian buffer. This says on all waters. Now,
Says waters of the state, which has a clear definition that's provided by DHEC. The waters of the state definition is lakes, bays, sounds, ponds, impounding reservoirs, springs, wells, rivers, streams, creeks, estuaries, marshes, inlet, canals, the Atlantic Ocean within the territorial limits of the state, and all the other bodies of surface or underground water, natural or artificial, public or private, inland or coastal, fresh or salt, which are wholly or partially within bordering the state or within its jurisdiction. But we have a further complement to that that says jurisdiction may overlap but be concurrent with both levels of government, or it may be reposed only to the state. Typically, only perennial, intermittent, and modified natural streams are regulated by DHEC. So DHEC, waters of the state, is what's within the state and what's under the regulations of DHEC.
okay, so these properties that have blue line streams, are they considered waters of the state?
They can be. Blue line streams are streams that appear as a broken or solid blue line or a purple line on the USGS map. Streams do not have to be blue line streams to be considered jurisdictional. So it could be, but generally what's required is an investigation by the engineer of record to determine if it's perennial or intermittent or a modified natural stream.
Well, in the blue line stream, generally, when you see those, do you think floodplain potential?
Not necessarily. Some blue line streams may not even be a blue line stream, that once the engineer goes out and investigates, it finds out that it's not a blue line stream. Of course, our floodplain maps is what defines really what's in a floodplain. Those usually appear bigger on the USGS maps than a blue line stream.
Several
right.
years ago, we had a group to come in and they mapped all the blue line streams and everything. I mean, the water running across people's creeks. What was the name of it? You remember that study that was done several years ago? I remember they walked some people off with a shotgun up in my.
Oh, Mr. Dell, you're correct. That's when they did the revision to the floodplain maps. And they came through in 2015, I believe, because we adopted the new maps then.
Even gullies running.
They
through
mapped
the
everything.
yard,
That's
anywhere
correct.
water ran.
And I ran into one that you just talked about out in the Simpsonville area. where a blue line stream showed, but when we went out there to look at it, it wasn't there anymore.
Right. If it's dry, it's generally not considered a blue line stream unless it's in drought conditions where an intermittent means that there has been water there at times.
Yeah.
So that has to be looked at to determine whether it is a true blue line, a true stream that is considered a waters of the state. So we feel we're only limiting it to waters of the state because blue line streams may not be a real creek.
Okay, thank you. 2236, 30% of the total acreage excluding undevelopable land, and that is defined, will be open space. Now, they're talking about power lines and other things that's undevelopable. So, and then you got to go on down to G, which says that if you have 40% of your land or more that is undevelopable, this 30% of open space requirement is waived. So I've got a little concern about this may be real subject to discussion here or interpretation. Anybody want to tackle that one?
Well, the developable and undevelopable open space are both defined, or we have proposed definitions. Really the issue that you're speaking to, it gets to the issue of, we want to be fair. We don't want to essentially say if you have a piece of property that is mostly undevelopable, basically say, well, because it's mostly undevelopable, then, per our requirements, it's almost wholly undevelopable. And so what we're trying to do, and, this 40%, that was staff's best effort to come up with a number that seemed reasonable, that would still enable a property to be developed as a major subdivision, while at the same time preserving significant open space. So just so we're all on the same page, let's just say that you have 100 acres and 40% of the acreage is in a wetland, or it is land that cannot be developed, is not fit to have any structure whatsoever. Then the only requirement in terms of open space that would apply to that 100-acre tract, of which 60 acres is developable, the only thing that would apply would be a 50-foot perimeter buffer. Now, if you have the same 100 acres and 10% of it is undevelopable, say there's a creek on the backside of the property, you have 90 acres that are developable. And so under that scenario, 30% of the land that is developable would still need to be set aside as open space. So at the end of the day, you would still have approximately 40 acres plus minus of open space on that 100-acre tract. Granted, there would be two separate tracts, but hopefully that illustrates the idea. And again, Mr. Ballard, to your point, whether or not that 40% is the right number, that's certainly up for discussion. And staff, we're not presumptuous enough to say that that's the right number, but that's what we came up with as we were working through it.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, if you allow me, that was my comment. I'm happy to speak to that if you'd let me, but just wanted to point that out.
Okay, yeah, you and I had discussed that, Mr. Harrison. What I want to ask is this: would it be better to set minimum and maximum parameter on this? That you've got to have a minimum of 30% open space. And we're not using undevelopable in that. So if there's undevelopable also, then it can't exceed 40% or 50% or whatever. I'm asking, is the question making any sense?
I think I understand what you mean. The fact is there's a lot of different ways we can kind of play around with these particular scenarios, and we're certainly open to ideas and suggestions. And again, Mr. Harrison has already had an opportunity to weigh in, so we're
Well,
open to it.
his point, and I agreed with it, is if 40% of your land is already, you can't do anything with it, we shouldn't tack on another 30. I agree with that completely. The question is, are we leaving ourselves liable for, well, we shouldn't get penalized here, we should get penalized there. I don't know. I understand what we're trying to do, but I also don't want to create a problem by doing it.
That's what concerns me about this, because I've got a lot of land that hangs off the side of a mountain. So how you gonna have open space there? I mean, you can build a house most anywhere, but now how did y'all look at how that's going to work when you get into the mountainous terrain? That with one shoe doesn't fit everybody. So how are we going to do that in places where we got a subdivision that wants to go in on the side of a mountain? Do y'all take that into account? Because 30% is a lot when you're talking about a mountainous terrain.
Mhm.
So how are we going to deal with that in here?
Well, the way
If
we
we
would,
don't see it, if we don't say it in here, then this will be the law.
So to your question, under the definition of undevelopable land, it does lay out that land with a slope greater than 30% would be considered undevelopable. So that would already be set aside for the mountainous areas.
Okay.
Mr. Barnes, you had a comment or question?
I think she just answered
Oh.
the question. I was wondering why did the 30% undevelopable land, why could it not be used? Why could it not be part of the great slopes and the wetland and even under power lines?
Yeah.
It's unbuildable. So could all that not be used for you 30% rather than?
Are you saying that you can't build a house on a 30% grade?
we're not saying that, but we're saying that per our draft, the idea that that a 30% grade is, for the purposes of this, would be considered undevelopable. And so we're basically, really what we're trying to do here is we want to make sure that the land that's set aside as open space is not just throwaway land, that it's not just the gully or the ditch or the easement under the power lines, that is actually of a higher quality. And so that's why we make a distinction between developable and undevelopable.
It may be helpful to think of this visually, and you all are open to do whatever it is you like. This is just a start, a draft, a conversation. But if you think about, let's just think about all the unzoned areas and all that green vegetation you see everywhere. And if we were to get a marker and begin to draw out all the floodplains and all the steep slopes, it may not be that much acreage. And then assume that everything else, if it could be developed, will be developed as people begin to sell their property and developers begin to pursue those areas as we see that they are. The question is, Greenville is called Greenville. So how green do we want to be unless we have a real conservation or open space plan, which we don't have currently? And there's a clear demand and a request to preserve and protect these areas. So what we're proposing is that, okay, you can't do anything with those environmentally sensitive areas already, but how can we begin to conserve the character and the quality of these areas and still allow development to occur because it's coming at a fast rate. So if you don't provide some restriction, it's just going to go. So the 30% outside of the constrained areas is to try to accomplish that of protection and quality of life, which there seems to be a desire for that. So if you get conservative and you say, let's just say 30% and not worry if it's undevelopable or developable land, which is what we do now. I mean, if you imagine that everything that can be developed will be developed, just imagine what Greenville County would look like and ask yourselves, is that what we want to do?
So by adding the discussion that we've got today and the wording that we've got today, what Rashida is saying is it provides even more protection with the larger percentage and the discussion between the undevelopable and developable, so that you're not going to see what you see today in the unzoned areas or the rural areas. You're going to see a better way to protect that and a better way to manage that so that you keep more of the green in that subdivision versus what you see currently, correct?
Correct.
That's right. And that's why it gets back to the, we started with the internal setbacks and things like that. We don't want to restrict property owners' right to develop. We want to make sure we trust that the development community knows how to build products that people are going to want to buy. We trust that, we've got an engineering community they're very bright and they know how to do this type of development. They're just not currently required to do so in the unincorporated parts. I'm sorry, in the unzoned parts of the county. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, it really is. This is going to be kind of what y'all feel is appropriate. And but staff, we felt it was our role to try to strike a balance between what we heard as being the priorities of the community in terms of wanting to conserve, and also the fact that we're one of the fastest growing communities in the country. And so we have to live in both places at the same time. So this really is it's hopefully a compromise that makes sense. Sometimes compromises aren't necessarily the best outcome, but we're trying to, by placing specific limits, but at the same time, really allowing for creativity and freedom. We're hoping that we're striking the right balance.
Now,
And I believe, Mr. Dill, one of the things that we heard over and over again from everybody, and when we're just about all the different folks that we've talked to, with the exception of probably one or two groups, was how do we preserve our rural quality of life? This is our attempt to tell you how to preserve it, not just conserve it, but how do you preserve it so that you're not clear cutting everything inside. And we're trying to strike a balance. Thank you, Mark.
the 50-foot buffer is included in this open space, which that's important in itself because that is a lot of area when you figure 50 feet in all the way around the perimeter of a subdivision.
That's right.
So it may not be as big a deal as I think it is right now, particularly with that 50 feet included. But I still have some concerns about how this is going to come together.
I do too. I'm concerned too, Mr. Chairman, about what is meant by E, F, and G. All required buffers may be credited toward meeting the open. That's exactly what it says, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And the septic and drain fields can also be counted as green space.
It actually says they're permitted. It doesn't say that they are actually part of the open space. They're permitted to be within that required open space. It's part of the
And
design.
it says for those parcels where the undevelopable land exceeds 40% of the total acreage to be subdivided, that can be counted. Is that what that
Well,
says?
No, that'll waive that additional 30%.
It says it
40%.
waives it.
Yeah, we're not going to add another 30 on top of it if 40% we can't do. The drain field, so you're saying, if I understand right, what you just said, Ms. Cooker, the drain field could run out into the open space.
That's correct. That's what that statement says.
Because drain fields usually stay within the property, the parcel.
I think that speaks more to if we have an independent package plant type system. or
Okay,
something like that, and or even separate septic, depending on how the locations are on each of the lots.
okay,
Gives flexibility to how you do that.
yeah.
And we walk on to the next.
Well, may I ask
Getting
a
ownership,
Joe,
that scares me.
may I ask a question?
Sure,
go ahead.
Before we move on.
Yeah.
Let me just make sure I got this part right. Are you, landowner has a parcel of land, and now where there are some unbuildable parts because it's a marsh or a grade or whatever else, that's accounts for, let's say we've got 30% of that. Are we penalizing that landowner with the good buildable land, saying we still, and I'm just using the word penalty as a devil's advocate. Okay, please don't. Are we saying now we cannot use that as our green space? We've got to create additional green space. And if that's the case, does that landowner get an increase in density? Are they allowed to increase the density on the buildable area? Is that what's going on?
I mean, assuming they have sewer, a 6,000 square foot lot is about 6.5 units per acre. So I don't think density is going to be the issue. And again, we're talking about the unzoned parts of the county. And so we're deliberately not addressing density head on. We're trying to say, look, there are certain things that the land development regulations ought to consider, and regulating residential density. Again, we could be wrong, but we sort of said, that's an issue where we're going to be dealing with zoning as part of the UDO. And so let's let the zoning piece of where we're headed pick up some of those density related issues. And again, let's not, in terms of, penalizing a landowner, I mean, we're trying to grant as much freedom and flexibility as possible to any given landowner. And, I take your point. I think it's where you start to get into okay, well, I have, 100 acres of, beautiful farmland. And so you're saying 30 acres of that I have to set off to the side, whereas so-and-so has 100 acres up in the mountains and you can't build on most of it, and that 30% is waived for him. Well, that doesn't seem fair. And I take your point. I think that's a good observation. And the answer is, we're trying to strike a balance. And I'm not saying that the balance that we're recommending is the right one, but that is something that we're very cognizant of, and we don't want to basically reduce or eliminate the ability of a property owner to develop any property, which is why we came up with, and again, Mr. Harrison, it was his idea really to come up with that 40% kind of cutoff, as far as, once you get above that, then only the perimeter standards would apply.
Okay, and I guess, and I don't have any criticism of the 40%. I just want to make sure is the idea of what you're trying to do is to not have a penalty based on the type of land you have, assuming the goal is to have as much green space as possible, which is a great goal. If we're going to impose more green space on a particular lot, are we going to allow greater density? So economically, there's no penalty there. We're encouraging developers to develop. That's all my point is, I guess.
So the density, even though this is not directly addressing density, the density will be, their ability to be more dense will be based on whether they have public sewer or not, access to public sewer. So the question is more so, does a developer who wants to have high density have a property that has access to public sewer? Not so much the ordinance. The ordinance is not driving density. It'll be the availability of infrastructure that will drive density.
Okay, all right.
I want to make one point, and I'm going back to Mr. Deal. I hope we all realize we're not going to come up with a perfect document. We're doing the best we can, but there may be a section or more than one section that we have to come back and revisit at another time. What we're trying to do with this document is lay the groundwork, as you said, Mr. Coker, to put some parameters out there, and it may take some trial and error. But we at least have set a goal to get there. Mr. Deal, you said you.
Yeah, I'd like to, before we do finalizing, I'd like to hear from developers that develop in the mountainous terrain, because, you know, we all understand that, you know, if you build it on flat pasture, that's one thing, but people that develop mountainous terrain and just like we, when we did our road, Ms. Workutter, you can remember that when we developed the county-wide road requirements. We took experts who had developed in the mountains and we looked at what they done. I'd love to know, because that 30% to me, it just keeps causing me anxiety. Because it's for the guy in the pasture, that might not be a big deal, but if you're talking about in the mountains, 30% could be a bunch of houses.
Well, we
We need to know that.
may have a situation here, well, we obviously do have, where one size doesn't fit all, and we may need to split that into two. But
there may be something that's acceptable or that's workable for the staff and for the community.
And Mr. Dale, just to clarify, with that very scenario in mind, that's where we came up with the idea that, and again, I'll let Mr. Harrison take credit for this, but let's just say you have a mountainous tract and it's mostly, you know, steep slopes and creeks. Maybe 70% of it you can't even build on. Well, the open space, that 30% would no longer apply because it's greater than 40% of the total property. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
Okay, okay. But I'd
But
still,
we're gonna have to say that.
and it does, it does say that under,
G,
Mr.
Thank you.
Dill and Mr. Ballard, we'd be glad to take a look at that wording, and if we need to tweak it, we will. I will remind everybody, though, that this, regardless of what happens when this goes forward to council, there is a public hearing component of this in there. And during that public hearing, people are allowed to speak in terms of what they like
Doesn't
or
it
they
have to
don't
go through
like.
the same procedure as any other ordinance?
Yes, sir, it does. And there is a public hearing that would have to be scheduled.
So the planning commission would have opportunity to look at this.
Mhm.
That's what I was hoping.
okay. Dr. Finn,
Let's talk about, are we through with this one here?
yeah, Dr. Finn had his hand up.
Go ahead.
First of all, Paula and staff, I've read over this a couple of times, and it's interesting how you guys put this together, and I applaud you, because if you go back to all of your emails, you see bits and pieces of all of your emails where everybody emails you has the perfect solution to this problem. And I see some people's stuff, some parts they said we don't see. So I think you guys did a good job of listening to everybody. And of course, you're right. One size doesn't fit all. I will say one thing. I do like the idea of the 30% and the fact that the buffer counts. And if you got undevelopable land, whether it's the side of a mountain, it counts. So I think that's real clear. Because what you don't want to do is make it so burdensome that you can't build anything in the unzoned areas, and then everything's too expensive and you can't build a house. Housing is so expensive now. I mean, you don't want to exacerbate the problem with over an extensive regulation. I want to say a couple of things. One, we have kicked this can down the road for 2 solid years. I mean, it's interesting the way I act like the world's on fire right now, but we've had opportunity to do something with this for 2 years. And it's always, we adjourn and go on to eat dinner or whatever else we do. So I'm glad finally that it got to the point where Judge Miller basically saying this is unconstitutional. Why don't you guys do your job? We have to do something. We got 6 lawsuits. You lost 1, and just leaving 3.1 as it is, you're gonna lose them too. And we always talk about we don't raise taxes and we don't waste taxpayer money. Well, that's exactly where this is headed if we don't get it together and get rid of 3.1 and come up with something to replace it. Now, here's more of my harder question, Paula, and this is probably the elephant in the room that we as council members talk about among ourselves late at night, past my bedtime, and I have to say, look, I got to go to work in the morning. But we don't talk about it in public. Does this rein in the unbridled, out of control actions of the Planning Commission? Because they are causing huge problems. Now, Cindy Clark's not one of them. She's here. But this waking up in the morning and trees being cut down, Planning Commission passed the subdivision in the unzoned area. We didn't know anything about it, didn't have anything to do with it. And then when we get lit up by our constituents, we look like we got a big lemon in our mouth.
So, Councilmember Fan, thank you.
And I got a follow-up to that.
Thank you. I think what this 3.1 does is it sets a new standard and it provides specificity for how you will develop in a conservation area, how you will look at traffic from now on, and how you will look at environmental. It actually does provide some specifics as to, I cannot answer what the Planning Commission will or won't do, but I can tell you that this sets a new standard and a new standard for them to follow and a new standard that provides more specificity, I think, for what everybody wants. Nobody's getting what they want in here, but nobody's getting everything they want. But does it help with the Planning Commission? Absolutely, when they say they wish it was much more specific and not so subjective.
All right, now here's my follow-up. When they did zoning late 60s, early 70s, they basically, the outside areas was all, and I've kind of hinted at y'all with this, RS. What would be the downside of versus going through all this and having all this subjectivity still? What would be wrong with doing the unzoned areas RS, period? Which basically you wouldn't be able to build big, long, sprawling subdivisions anyway in RS. And then if you wanted to get more specific with apartments or tighter zoning, R15, R12, then you would have to go through the normal process, going back to council, and then we don't get clobbered by constituents with subdivisions going up that we didn't know anything about.
I believe that if RS was used as a holding zone originally, when the county was zoned, right now, RS would not take into account or consideration all the agricultural issues and discussions that have been coming up because of lot size. So you would have to look at what would be appropriate to make sure you had that covered completely. So RS would not take care of a lot of the uses you have right here, right now. And you really don't want to have non-conforming uses out there. So you don't want to set it up as RS and then half of what you've got and you've just set up as RS is non-conforming.
True, okay.
And
Well, and to having just zoned 7,700 acres, part of it was R3, part of it was RR1, none of it was RS. RS used to be the step down from RR1, and we had one out in my area that the neighbors just threw a fit going to RS. And so, okay, it's 1:25. I'm gonna let Mr. Dill, you had one more question, or did you want?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about who is going to be responsible. We just went through a big thing down on the east side about who owns the green space. And see, I've had developers that have went broke and they left the state. They left the ownership to each property owner. Does that mean that if on this green space, who's going to maintain it? Are we going to do the same thing we had to do about the roads? Are we gonna put a bond on that green space so that we've got enough money that someday, if it happens, the county can take that bond and step in and cut the grass? What are we gonna do? Because I see that we say the homeowners association, nonprofits, quasi public organizations and public jurisdictions and things like that'll maintain it, but what if all that fails? What's the stopgap? Because we just went through that down on the east side, remember? And we don't want to go through that in my neighborhood.
Well.
Green space is wonderful. I love it.
Well,
And if you got a lot of goats, it's profitable.
I think the main thing I'll tell you, I'm not advising that the county be the owner of the green space.
No.
Or the maintainer of the green space. I think traditionally these things have been handled through requirements of HOAs to be set up where it is part of that community. And I would advise that that would be the way to go here. The issue we had on the east side, if we're talking about the Claremont situation, was really a zoning violation, in essence, that the HOA was still active in maintaining and just was simply looking for a way to avoid some things that the developer had allowed to happen. I think we're more vigilant about that. I think codes is now, there's an LDR element to codes now.
I would let all of you know while he's talking about this, because I think this is important. One of the things that came out of the Claremont case was, of course, that it was a zoning issue, not necessarily the homeowners association. So it's a little bit different from ownership of the open space. But we, in fact, knew that we had that issue. We also knew that we have to do a better job of policing and looking at what's going on with our subdivisions and whether they're meeting their requirements. So we do now have a zoning enforcement officer that works in our codes enforcement officer very closely with Josh and T, so that they can follow up to make sure signs are posted, to make sure they've built the subdivision the way they're supposed to, particularly if it's an FRD, and that the open space is being required. And also if there is a violation that relates to the zoning, which relates to the open space, that's taken care of.
Enforced.
And it can be enforced.
Work with them, but it can be enforced.
So tell me what's going to happen. That means that we're going to police it and we're going to make them the homeowners, or if there's no other alternative, the developer's gone, we're going to make the homeowners
I think what you need,
maintain the green space.
Mr. Dill and members of the committee, we have this, let's talk about this because it's twofold. One, we have where the HOA is responsible for the detention ponds or any stormwater facility, and they have to maintain and take care of that. And that's usually tied to the open space also when we do the agreement now with subdivisions. So all of that's incorporated in that ownership agreement before we'll even accept the subdivision into the system. So that's one piece of it. On that side of it, there are inspectors from the stormwater side that literally on a 3-year, 5-year basis, check all the ponds in the county. And I know you think, oh my gosh, it takes you 5 years, but there's like 3 people that do this. But there's somebody there that's inspecting it. A lot of this is done on complaint driven. I mean, you know how many times you've sent me an issue about a pond, or Mr. Ballard, you have, and we send someone out to check it and they're required to maintain it, and we can enforce that. We have that same ability now if it's an FRD or conservation subdivision, where if they're not following the guidelines and they haven't built it to what the plan specified, we can send someone out that actually enforces that. Does that help you?
That helps me to understand it.
And we do have that one new enforcement
I just
officer.
don't want to come up at the end of the road and then it's like the detention ponds.
Yeah, I
Grown up and nobody's
Well,
policing them.
well,
on the new
All right.
ponds,
I was gonna say, one thing is that we're making sure before you can issue your final plat is that Rashida is making sure, and her staff, that we are getting a copy of the restrictive covenants and that's been recorded, and that it shows on the final plat that that's all going to be in the ownership of the homeowners association. So we're making sure
Have one.
before the very first house can be even built, we're making sure those safeguards are being put in place.
All right, it is 1:30. First of all, I want to thank staff in total for all the work you did here. As Dr. Fant said, we see things that all of us had seen that were sent in that have become part of this. So you truly did take input from everybody that responded. I had hoped to get to a place by 1:30 that we could move forward. What's the sense of the committee at this moment?
We need one more meeting, Mr. Chairman.
I agree. We probably need one more meeting, and I
I'd like
think
to see what staff
Paula can
does.
incorporate some of the suggestions. I think there was a consensus
That's
on,
right.
Okay.
and have
so
that for the
I'd
next one.
like to see those suggestions.
Now
I
that-
made a motion, we never voted on, but I'll take it that that meant to the staff to go ahead and make that
Yeah.
correction.
So I want to be clear, I want to be very clear because I've taken some notes and others. I understand you would like to see a better definition of agricultural in here. So we want that. And there were a lot of questions. Did we answer all your questions, or do you need something other than the agricultural definition redefined?
Some little, I don't need it, but
The green,
they keep talking about it.
The 40 and 30?
40%, the 30 or 40%.
we,
I understand it, but we talked
we
about it
need
20 minutes.
and the
to,
mountainous terrain.
We'll be glad to do that. So mountainous
No.
terrain, guys, and I'm
all
writing
right,
notes.
my question is this.
Build in the mountains, you deserve to be able to develop more property than somebody that's. developing
Mountainous
on a
terrain,
flat.
40 and 30% in ag.
I mean, that costs a
Got it.
whole lot more money to build a house on the side of a mountain than it does in flat ground.
All right, initially, if we couldn't finish today, I had hoped to be back here on Thursday. Does that give staff sufficient time to address these issues?
I mean, we have a draft ag. We can better define the other ones. I mean, staff, I'll defer to you, but I feel like with what we've heard today, we can do this pretty quickly. Yeah, they're good.
Thursday's good with me.
All right, we're back here.
I do have a question. I don't think it's gonna be long. Can staff, can it be bifurcated north and south? Can it be two different, that's just a question you guys can work on it, not
Okay.
trying to hold up the meeting. The other one is, can it be implemented district by district? Those are just questions. I'm not trying to monkey wrench anything here, just
Well,
questions.
I think the north and south primarily would be this open space thing because of the difference in the terrain. You know, I'm flat from the southern connector to the bottom of the county, and you go like that. All right, we're back here at 12 o'clock on Thursday, hopefully to put this to bed and move on. Thank you.